There's a ton of noise out there. So how do you get decision makers to pay attention to your brand? Start a podcast and invite your ideal clients to be guests on your show. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show. Welcome back to B2B Growth. I'm your host for today's episode, Logan Lyles with Sweetfish Media. Today is going to be another episode in our Why Podcast Work series. In this series, we've been talking to a lot of our current customers here at Sweetfish and other podcasters at B2B brands in the value that they're seeing from podcasting. Today's going to be a little bit of change up from that normal format. We're going to be talking about an industry trend and something that we've been watching over the last 6 months that really shows the massive opportunity, especially in B2B marketing for podcasting. So several months ago, Spotify made a huge bet on the future of the podcasting industry. And we want to talk about that. We're also going to talk about some of the stats that are pretty eye-opening in how people are consuming audio content. Now, we've talked in this series about ways that you can use audio content to create other content, but I don't want to just skip over the fact that people are consuming more audio content. It fits the way that we live today. There are so many times, last Friday night, I did something I didn't do in a while. I went for a run. And guess what I was doing when I was running with the dog on the leash? I was not consuming an ebook. I was not attending a webinar. I was not reading a blog post or watching a YouTube video. I was listening to a podcast. That was time that I could only consume audio content. So we're going to be talking about some of the stats and the ways that, not just me anecdotally, but people in general and the masses are consuming audio content and podcasts specifically. So that bet that I talked about with Spotify, their $340 million acquisition of Gimlet and Anchor shows that they are really making a move to try, in our opinion, to become the Netflix of podcasting. There's really no dominant network of podcasts just yet. Now, as far as directories, platforms, Apple Podcasts still by far and away, by the nature of being the default standard installed app that people can listen to podcasts on their iPhone, it's pretty much the standard there. But there's massive opportunity to gain and retain the attention of people who are like me, who are consuming content when they're doing the dishes, walking the dog, going for a run, at the gym. I'm not going to pretend that last one is usually me, but we'll skip right past that. So here are some of those stats that to us seem to indicate, why Spotify is making this move and why you should be thinking about podcasting. So 1 in 4 Americans listen to podcasts daily, and a number of people also listen to at least one podcast episode per week. So when you combine those together, it's actually 35% of the American population that listen to podcasts on a regular weekly or greater than weekly basis. Number 2, 87% of all podcast listeners have said that they listen to all or most of every podcast episode that they start. So if you think about that, a lot of shows that I listen to are anywhere from 20 to 45 minutes long. That is a lot of time spent with your brand, with almost 9 out of 10 listeners listening to the entire episode or pretty much the entire episode. And compare that to how much time they're spending on a web page or on that blog post that you're trying to get them them to the bottom of. And at the same time, you're not taking time away where they could be consuming other content. You're gaining new market share of attention is the way that we think about it. So I thought that those first two stats were really telling. 35% of Americans listening to podcasts on a very regular basis. 2, 87% of all podcast listeners report to listening to most or all of every episode that they start. And then the third is that the average listener that was surveyed in this research that Chartable was quoting is that the average listener listens to 7 episodes a week. So one, that points to why we're seeing success with our own show and other shows that are multiple times per week or daily shows like Flip My Funnel from Terminus, the Sales Engagement podcast from Outreach, and other shows that we're starting to produce in our network of collective podcasts. So those 3 stats really are telling. And, Spotify didn't make a $300+ million bet on an industry that had reached its max, that had reached its plateau. And I hear this kind of alluded to with a lot of marketers and other people that I talk to. Are we reaching, max saturation with podcasting? Are people getting podcast fatigue? These stats prove that out, that that's not the case. The other stat that I found really interesting in this article from Chartable, we'll link to it in the show notes, by the way, is that there are about 700,000 podcasts live in Apple Podcasts. Now, of those 700,000, that sounds like a big number, but 1, most of them are not active. 2, most of them are not posting regularly, weekly, or at a greater frequency. And 3, if you look at that 700,000 number, it does not look like that big a number when you compare that to the 35 million YouTube channels currently on YouTube and the ubiquitous number of blogs. So there will always be noise. The noise will always get greater. Are you going to, wipe your hands and sit back and say that there's just too much? Or are you going to take advantage of the massive opportunity that brands like Spotify are pushing their chips to the center of the table to become the Netflix of podcasting, and see that there's opportunity for your brand as well? Whether you are a 10-person startup or a mid-market or enterprise brand with a 50+ person marketing team, there is opportunity for us all in B2B to take advantage of the increased listenership and the greenfield opportunity to gain and retain new market share of attention of the buyers that we're so desperately trying to reach. So sorry, I got a little fired up on this one, but for me, fired up is probably just an 8 out of 10 with my mellow personality. But hopefully you guys got some value from this, and we were able to share a little bit of where the industry is going and things that you might want to be thinking about in why you might want to take your podcast to the next level and increase the frequency, or why you should start a podcast if you haven't yet for your brand. So I'm regularly putting out content like this, not only in this feed here in the Why Podcast Work series on B2B growth. If you like these episodes, just look for #Why Podcast Work in B2B growth, or go to sweetfishmedia.com/blog and look in the categories for Why Podcasts Work under our #series names. As always, I love connecting with listeners. Hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm Logan Lyles on LinkedIn, and I'm at I am Logan Lyles on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you guys got a ton of value out of this episode.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big 3, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.